So we've gotten an idea of how to read some of the information on our patterns. And up until now, all we've had to worry about is making sure that we are cutting with our grain line parallel to our selvage. But our patterns can tell us a little bit more information beyond what their names are, what to cut them out of, and how to position the grain line. I have all of the sample book patterns printed here, and I'm going to show you some things on a couple of them for you to be aware of. These two patterns, for example, show a couple of symbols and a dashed line. These symbols, as indicated on these particular patterns, are notches. And you'll find notches indicated on patterns in a plethora of different ways. Sometimes a notch is just a solid line, a line a little bit thicker than the rest of the pattern piece lines. Sometimes you'll see them indicated by a small V or a U shape, depending on the pattern maker and the manufacturer for those patterns. But so you're aware, with these sample book patterns, any of these little T-shaped symbols are all notches. Now, notches are important because they allow us to piece together the puzzle of our sewing patterns. They ensure that certain seams will line up properly. So it's very important that you copy your notches when you cut your patterns. I'll show you how to go about doing that. I'm going to grab my scrap piece of muslin here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut out 2 copies of this 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern. I know that I need to cut 6 of them because I'll need 6 of them for the entirety of the sample book, but I'm comfortable cutting 2 at a time. So I'm going to position this, pin it, and cut it so you can see the process. I'm measuring from my selvage edge, making sure that it's properly aligned. This is Editing Marjorie here. Please, please, please iron your fabric. Use plenty of steam and iron it flat before you ever place your patterns. Pin this in place. Again, I will be pinning on bias. I'm actually going to, once this is set, before I finish pinning, I'm going to take the rest of my fabric and fold it underneath so that I can cut 2 at a time. Cutting on fold is the least accurate means of cutting your patterns. Be aware that when you're working on garment patterns, you do not want to cut on fold if it can be avoided. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do, but if you can avoid cutting on fold, please do, because it is not at all accurate and it can lead to cutting on bias. I'm going to go ahead and pin this pattern as well. May as well cut both of these at the same time. Now I'm going to grab a pair of scissors and I'm just going to cut both of these pattern pieces. I'm cutting through my pattern and 2 layers of muslin at the same time. Now I've just cut off my selvage edge from the rest of my fabric, so I'm going to put a mark on my fabric so I don't forget which direction my grain line is going in. But I also have another selvage edge over here, just in case. Always cut your patterns flat on the table. Keep your work flat on the table. Keep your scissors flat on the table. It's going to give you the most control when cutting. Okay, so I've got these two cut. They're both cut out of 2 layers of muslin. And when I go to work on the sample books, I know that I still need to cut 4 more of these and 2 more of these, just so I have enough for my full sample book. But we're just going to work with these for right now. I'm going to set the 1/2 inch seam allowance pattern aside, and I want to talk to you all about how to place your notches and what these dashed lines mean. For this particular pattern, it is a seam allowance pattern, so this allows a 3/4 inch seam allowance along one side. So this dashed line is marking out that seam allowance. It's 3/4 of an inch from this raw edge. And the notches also indicate that seam allowance. Generally speaking, when you're working on a pattern, you will usually just place your notches. Any internal lines like this, you can or you may or may not transfer. But for the samples that we're getting ready to do, I do want you to transfer these dashed lines. So get into the habit of transferring these dashed lines, especially for these seam finish samples that we're going to do in just a little while. I'm just going to remove my pins really quickly so they don't get in the way. I'm still pinned on this side, so my fabric isn't going to go anywhere. And I'll show you how we can transfer this line to our fabric using transfer paper. This is wax-free transfer paper, Sarol brand. There it is, wax-free transfer paper. Comes in a roll inside. Be careful, it is powdery, it is dusty a little bit. It will get on your fingers when you start working with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this transfer paper and I'm going to fold it so that I have pigment facing out on both sides. And I'm going to slide this in between my 2 layers of fabric. I've got my pattern on top. I'm now going to reach and slide this in between these 2 layers of fabric. Lay that flat. This will ensure when I go to transfer, I will get marks on this side of my fabric as well as this side. So I'm essentially tracing 2 lines at once. I'm going to hold this down, grab my serrated tracing wheel, and roll along this dashed line. Slowly, carefully, putting enough pressure on there so I can ensure that my line is getting transferred to both pieces of fabric. I can remove my transfer paper, and if I open this up, I should see I've got a little bit here, not quite as noticeable on this one. I can see it, but still have everything pinned together. I'll go over it one more time. Put a little bit more pressure on there. That's a little bit better. You can at least see that line there. There's the 2 transferred lines. So that is one method of transferring your dashed lines. Get into the habit of doing this for your seam finish samples. And just so we can be absolutely certain of where that seam line is, even if our transferred lines get rubbed away, I'm going to clip into my notches. Every time you see a notch, you should see it along the outer edge of your pattern. So notches are indicated by actually cutting into the fabric. I'm going to take my scissors, I'm going to slide it, keeping my scissors flat on the table, slide it between all of the layers, my pattern as well as my fabric. It's good practice to place your thumb at the end of this T because you are not going to cut through your fingers. And that serves as a stopping point for the tip of your scissors, just so you know how far to push so you're not clipping too deep. If you start making notches too deep, you end up with holes in your pattern. I'll show you that one more time. I'll turn the pattern around and zoom in so you can see how I go about clipping this notch over here. keeping my scissors flat on the table, sliding it through all layers, placing my thumb at the end just to give my scissors a stopping point right there, and then snip. So now I've transferred this mark by actually cutting into my fabric. I should have a cut on both pieces of fabric, and they should be all in the same place. So we now know how to read the name of our pattern, how much or how many we should cut of what kind of fabric, how to position it on our fabric, how to transfer internal lines, and how to notch our patterns. The next thing I'll show you are tailor's tacks. So I've just cut out 2 copies of my zipper pattern. I know I need 6 eventually. I've got 2 done, so I'll need to do 4 more. I've aligned my grain line. I pinned everything in place. I had it pinned in all 4 corners, but I have since removed these 2 pins because I want to show you one more method for transferring these marks. Before, I opened up my paper so that I had pigment on both sides and placed that in between my fabric. I'll show you another method where you can take your paper, fold it so that the pigment is to the inside, lift your pattern, and slide. I'm lifting my pattern out of the way. I'm lifting up my transfer paper. I'm going to place my fabric on there. So I've got transfer paper, 2 layers of fabric, and then transfer paper. I'm going to close that back down and trace over this. So this way you don't have the transfer paper pigment flying all over the table. This should mark that piece as well as that piece at the same time. I just got to scoot this up here because I have a smaller piece of transfer paper here, and I will continue marking that dashed line as I go up. So again, that will add a mark to this piece of muslin as well as this piece underneath. Now we've discussed notches. I'm going to go ahead and clip my notches. There are 3 notches on this pattern. Again, keeping my work flat on the table, placing my thumb at the end of that notch and clipping into it. I'll do the same here, going through all the layers including the pattern, and snip into there. And again over here. If you don't clip the whole T shape, that's perfectly fine. You want to clip about 1/8 of an inch or more. And the more you get accustomed to this, the more you'll get accustomed to how deep to clip your fabric. The next thing I want to show you on our pattern notation are tailor's tacks, which is indicated by this little dot here. Now tailor's tacks can be indicated by a variety of symbols. You will see solid dots on patterns like that. You will also see open dots like the patterns for our plain darts sample. So if you see an open dot or a solid dot, just know they mean the same thing. Because I do want you all to get accustomed to reading the notation on patterns, even though the notation might look different from one manufacturer to the next. Now, in order to do a tailor's tack, I need a needle and thread. Now we talked about hand stitching, so go ahead and get a needle and put some thread into it, some kind of contrast fabric so that you can clearly see the color against your muslin. I'm going to pull my 2 tail ends of my thread until they're close to one another. Now, when you do a tailor's tack, you do not want to put a knot in your thread. You just need a double length of thread on your needle. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see what's happening here. There's my little dot. Here is my needle with my thread in it. I'm going to pick up my pattern. I'm going to place my hand underneath to support it. And just as we did with the running stitches, I'm going to push my needle all the way through the fabric and the pattern. So I'm going all the way through the pattern, all the way through the fabric. There's the tip of my needle on the back. And I've got my hand underneath here, so as soon as that needle comes through, I can feel that it's made it all the way through. And again, I'm going to use my finger to support the tip of the needle and push the tip of the needle back out through the fabric, so through the pattern. So I've gone through the pattern and 2 layers of fabric. If I flip it over, you can see there's a bit of my needle going through all layers. I've got the tip of my needle coming back out here. I'm going to push that through and pull my thread along. Pull your thread until you have about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of threads left. You want to leave these tails hanging out here. And I'm going to do that same stitch again. I'm going to go down through my pattern and my fabric, push up from underneath, and go through that same point again. You can see where my old stitch is, and that little piece of metal is the needle going through all my layers. Push that through again, and as you pull this, pull it slowly, and wait until you get a small loop of thread here. My loop doesn't want to untangle itself. It's a little bit twisted. There we go. So I went through and I pulled, and I had these tails left. I took another stitch and I pulled, and now I have a loop of thread left. And now I'm going to cut what's left of my tails. Just going to snip those, set my needle and thread aside. So now I have this kind of loop-de-loop shape, and I have stitched through both the pattern and my 2 layers of fabric. This is why I tend to only cut 2 layers of fabric at a time. Please do not try to put a tailor's tack through multiple layers of fabric. It will only work through 2 layers of fabric. So I took 1 stitch and left tails. I took another stitch, left a loop, and then I trimmed off the rest of my thread, leaving tails on the other end, creating this loop-to-loop shape. Now, I've marked everything that I need to on this pattern. I have my notches cut, I have my dash line, my seam allowance, my seam stitching line. This is technically your stitching line. That's been copied. Now I can take the pins out. I've transferred all of the marks. My tailor's tack is in there. My notches are there. My internal lines are copied. I can remove my pins. Now I'm going to pull the paper, and as I pull the paper up, you're going to see this loop of thread get smaller and smaller. You want to peel the paper back carefully, hold your threads from underneath, and then pop the paper through. The thread is actually going to tear through your paper pattern. There he goes. We just pulled that through. It's going to leave a little bit of a hole in your paper pattern, but that's fine. You can always reuse it. You know where that point is. We can set the paper pattern aside, and now we've got this tailor's tack stuck in our fabric. There's that same loop-to-loop, and it's going through both layers of fabric. Now, when we get ready to sew this, you can peel both of the fabric layers apart slowly and carefully. I'm going to hold this side down with one hand and tug the other side until it stops. You'll see that other loop that we created in our loop-to-loop is now nested onto the fabric, and we've got some strings hanging between the two. Grab your scissors or your snips, cut through all of these threads in the middle, and now you have this point and this point marked on your patterns in the exact same place. You sewed it with both layers together, so now when you peel them apart, these 2 points should be in the exact same place. In order to prevent these threads from falling out over time, you're going to want to mark these just to be safe, so you know where that point is. Now, is this the only way to mark internal points on your pattern? No, but it is the more accurate and more traditional way of doing so. I'm just going to mark those with my friction pen, and now I've got those 2 points copied. So I have notches, I have traced lines, and I have tailor's tacks. These are all indicators to help me when I get ready to sew this pattern. So if you see any kind of marks on any sewing patterns, make sure to transfer them. You may see them in the form of notches, you may see them in the form of tailor's tacks or internal lines that need to be traced, but they're all important and they all help you piece the puzzle back together.